Hey Reluctant Preppers, you could have been watching this video the moment it came out
by going to HealingYoureself.Life and subscribing to our new sister channel, Healing Yourself. See you there! HealingYoureself.Life provides information for awareness, educational, and support purposes only and does not diagnose or prescribe treatment for any medical condition. Viewers are encouraged to do their own due diligence and consult with their own medical caregivers before making personal treatment decisions. Welcome back to HealingYoureself.Life. I'm Dunnigan Kaiser.
And I'm Melody Kaiser.
And we have a first-time guest today. He's an expert on biodynamic farming and about how to read between the lines on product labeling to make sure we're getting what's really healthy for our bodies. Eugene Trufkin grew up on a biodynamic farm in Ukraine and joins us today to chat about how easily we can transition from factory-farmed food to organic and hopefully one day biodynamic while not falling victim to misleading marketing claims. Eugene, thank you for joining us this first time on HealingYourself.Life.
Yep, thank you. Thanks for having me as a guest.
We were quite impressed with your bio that you shared with us about how you've dedicated your entire life to understanding mental and physical health, and you currently operate Trufkin Athletics in Irvine, California. I've checked your website. It's quite impressive. We'll put a link to it in the description about a fat loss training center, holistic approach to fat loss and wellness, graduate from UCLA, University of California, Irvine, and a Czech Institute trained professional. You hold a degree from the National Academy of Sports Medicine. Thanks, as always. We like to thank our guests for being here because we get to ask you questions that benefit us and benefit our viewers, and we all learn together. And one of the things that we wanted to talk to you about is your book. You've got your book out, and can you tell us a moment about the purpose about this, about anti-factory farming, and what the title of the book is, and what people can find out about in it, and we'd like to ask you some questions about that.
Yeah, so basically, I grew up when the USSR was still around in Ukraine. So it's been a while, and basically I grew up on an off-grid biodynamic farm. And then kind of when the USSR collapsed, basically we moved over here like a few years after that, and when I walked into a supermarket for the first time at age 10, I thought like Americans mastered biodynamic, like ultra organic farming. I mean, I'm like, man, look how much produce they can produce biodynamically. It's unbelievable because visually, you know, like organic produce or biodynamically produced and factory farm stuff, it kind of like visually looks all the same, like at the store. So you can't even tell the difference. So I thought like all along, it was basically biodynamically produced food. And biodynamically produced food is basically where you have like an organic ecosystem that has like animals, plants, and soils living in kind of like one self-sustaining ecosystem. It's kind of like what most people have a mental image of when they think of like the farming life. They see like the two couples, the fork, and then like a bunch of different animals, a bunch of different crops, and kind of self-sustaining, kind of small farmer type living. And that's kind of how I grew up. So I thought that's how everyone was doing it. So for many, many years, I just kind of shopped at Costco. I'm like, man, they can do this so well, and they're selling like 50 eggs for $1.50. You know, you can't beat that price. They have this system down. But then, like a few years ago, I ran into this video called "The Dirt Facts," and it was presented by a guy named Paul Chek, which is like huge into anti-factory farming as well, and just like holistic health in general. And the information he basically described there made me think like, oh man, there's something wrong. That food isn't produced the way we're producing it on that off-grid farm in Ukraine. And it's like dramatically different. And basically, it was hard to understand, to look past all the gimmicky marketing phrases and all the deception and everything, to even, when you do want to source high-quality food, to even know how to buy that food, it's difficult. So obviously, a lot of people don't care for the most part. They're looking for the cheapest food, and that's okay if they want to do that. But even for the population that does care and that does really want to improve their health, it's still extremely difficult to overcome all of the propaganda that kind of leads to a lot of misleading information in the food industry. So a lot of times you're buying, like, for instance, sometimes, let's say a knowledgeable nutritionist will tell you like, oh, okay, go buy chicken, you know, start eating a little bit more chicken instead of eating this and this processed food, and just make sure it's, let's say they even say make sure it's free range and make sure it's organic. Okay, so 99% of people will take this information and they'll go to the grocery store and they'll see free-range organic chicken sold at the grocery store, which is found in most grocery stores these days. And they'll think like, okay, this chicken's running around outside in the open pasture 24/7.
Wait, I got to interrupt you, because first they're thinking, why am I lying on the floor of the grocery store looking up at the fluorescent lights? And it's because they fainted when they saw the price tag. Go ahead.
Yeah, and we can talk about whether organic food is really that much more expensive. I did kind of like a study at home, and we'll kind of talk about that a little bit later if you like. But basically, like, a person will see free-range organic chicken, and they'll think, once again, they're running around in open pastures. They're eating a species-specific diet. It's as natural as it gets. But in reality, free-range, what does it mean? It means they have like a huge shed with about like 50, 60, 70,000 chickens, like shoulder to shoulder. Basically, maybe like 1.5 or 1.2 square feet of space per chicken. So that's basically a sheet of printing paper, like a normal sheet of printing paper. And free range, all that requires is basically access to the outdoors and access to a small concrete patio. And that's it.
Wow.
So that's basically how they're born and raised. Most of them actually end up just staying inside because the doors are so small, and obviously they're so young because the birds are basically raised within like a 4 to 8 week period. So they're so young, they're still intimidated by like this light that's flashing outside the door, and they don't even want to step out. So if you go to a lot of these operations, you'll see basically like 50 chickens outside in this concrete patio, and then the rest of the 50,000 chickens are just stuck inside. So it's basically a very stereotypical factory farmed operation in that case. And more important,
I was just going to say, when most people think of free range, and when I do, I think that they have free access to the outdoors, and they can, eat their bugs, and especially chickens. That's what they like to do.
Run
around the farmyard. Yeah. And that's, I had relatives who did farming, and that's what they did. And I assume that, so you're saying really free range is not really an honest, I guess, an advertising thing. It can be very different.
Yeah, it's one of the most deceptive phrases on the market these days.
Okay.
And basically, like, there's one, for instance, people can look up this article called The Intrepid, and it's an investigative study done by Direct Action Everywhere. It's basically like an animal rights organization. They do like very, very good undercover research on a lot of these factory farms. And there was a free-range chicken supplier to Whole Foods, and obviously people associate Whole Foods with the highest end type of food you can buy. And they basically did, I forgot exactly the amount of months, but it was like 6 to 8 month investigation where they snuck into these operations that were supplying free-range chicken to Whole Foods, and they basically planted hidden cameras running 24/7 outside of these operations. And within that 6 to 8 month period, they didn't see like a single chicken roaming outside.
Wow.
And they also took soil samples everywhere. And remember, like, one chicken is basically pooping like 4 to 5 pounds of poop per month. So if you have like 50,000 of them, you would think you would find one sample of fecal matter somewhere outside if they're really roaming outside. They couldn't find anything in the soil. So,
wow.
And that's kind of like usually the case. It's not the exception of the rule. It's usually the rule.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and I think the other thing that strikes me too, when I hear cage free, I think, oh, they've got plenty of room, they can move. But really what this sounds like, and I remember back in Minnesota, you see these huge, huge buildings, and they're all crammed in there. It's like they're in cages, really. I mean, they don't have to be, but they are, because they're just so close together.
A communal jail cell.
Yeah, pecking each other, and for room and space. And so even cage-free, it sounds like, doesn't mean anything. So maybe can you also explain then, I mean, what should we be looking for? The pasture-raised eggs, what does all that mean? Because some of this is new to me too, and I think it's probably for our viewers. We assume when we're buying organic, free range, we're actually getting something that's seen the outdoors, and maybe that's not necessarily true. So this is kind of shocking.
Yeah, and that's to do with the living standards too, and that's debatable. A lot of people are like, oh, I don't care about how the chicken is raised in terms of their living conditions. And some people are for the ethical treatment and raising of animals as well. But more importantly, what applies to everyone, because in my opinion, like, no matter what you want to do in life or who you want to be, whether it's a computer programmer or to do what you guys are doing, like, mental and physical health always has to be number one and a priority. Because how are you going to accomplish any of that stuff if you're dealing with something like chronic low back pain or like mental depression, for instance? Like, you can't accomplish any of your goals, no matter what those goals are. So
when I think, sorry to interrupt again, but when I hear, it is true that you don't necessarily have to care for the animals. I happen to care about them, but really you want to be ingesting high quality food. And if you're buying from a factory farm where the animals aren't treated and they have a high anxiety, you're going to ingest that and you're going to get all of those hormones in your body, and it's going to be unhealthy for you. So even if you don't care about the animals, you should care about what you're putting in your own body. You don't want your food being stressed out. You don't want your food being stressed out. Yeah, that would be my opinion. Right.
There is that Native American kind of mindset that if your food was miserable and you eat the misery of that food as well. But moreover, what I was getting at was in terms of the food that they're actually fed. So a lot of times in these on the labeling of these free-range operations, at the bottom, you'll see vegetarian fed. Now, this is another marketing gimmick because a lot of Americans associate vegetarians with kind of healthy people. So they'll think like, oh, if the chicken is vegetarian, then it's healthy too. But in reality, chicken is an omnivore. Like, when was the last time you gave like a worm to a bird and it said, no, I don't eat worms? You know, it like never happened. So what happens when you see vegetarian fed on these labels, it really just means grain-fed. And grain-fed, I mean predominantly corn and soy-fed. And the problem with that is when you're feeding an omnivore a not species-specific diet, which is, once again, just predominantly grain, corn, and soy, what happens is it shoots the omega-6, the micronutrient omega-6, way up in the meat. And omega-6 is basically a pro-inflammatory micronutrient. So it's going to cause like a lot of inflammation in people that eat this food on a daily basis. And if a person is interested in this, they can look up inflammation theory of the disease, and they'll see that 95+% of disease basically exists only because of low-grade chronic inflammation.
That's fascinating. We have a doctor of chiropractic and a nutrition specialist, Dr. David Seaman, who we interview on this channel. He's written several books about deflame your diet and so on, and he talks exactly about what you're talking about, is that a pro-inflammatory state is very unhealthy for your entire body, and that can be influenced heavily by the food that you eat. But you're saying it can even be influenced by the food that our animal food was fed. Yeah.
Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and not only to your physical body, but to your mind too. People with chronic high inflammation in their body have more mental illness as well. So it kind of goes hand in hand. I'm not saying like just eating that is going to cause all these debilitating problems, but if you combine like how the average person in America is living, like working a lot of hours, they might not be ultra stressed, but they have this low-grade chronic stress, which is actually worse than the super intense stress, but that happens very infrequently. The stress that usually happens on a daily basis, but just like all the time and is relentless back to back, is more damaging to your body, causes more inflammation in your body. And then when you combine that, and you combine like financial stress, family stress, not enough time for yourself, not sleeping too well, having 10 cups of coffee, plus like having all this meat that's really high in omega-6, really low in omega-3, there's too much inflammation in your body. And it's kind of like evident, kind of when you do walk outside today in America, pretty much anywhere, you can just take a look around and a lot of people aren't looking too healthy anymore, so like mentally or physically healthy anymore. So kind of like results speak for themselves. You don't even have to take my word for your opinion. Right.
So when I would ask then, what should we be looking for? I think maybe you want to touch on pasture raised, what the difference between pasture raised versus free range and cage free eggs and meats. It sounds like really we should be looking for pasture raised organic, because then they really have to be out on the pasture. Is that correct? Or
yeah, exactly. And this is kind of like there's a little bit of wiggle room here too, because a lot of times people associate the small farmer that's working at the farmer's market as the elite farmer. But like, just because you're self-employed doesn't mean you're like really good at what you do. It just means you're self-employed, and it means you're a local producer, and that's good if you're kind of keeping that money circulating in that local ecosystem. That's great as well, but it doesn't mean you've kind of like mastered the proficiency of your craft. So a lot of times when you do go to these small farmers and they say, yeah, my birds are pasture raised, I mean, some things to look for. Sometimes farmers will give them access to the outdoors all the time, but the problem is they don't rotate them onto fresh pasture daily. And that could be because of a couple of reasons. Sometimes they just don't have the energy to do that, they don't have the crew to do that, or they just don't have the land to do that. So it'll be kind of like a shed with an open front. They really are allowed outdoor access all the time. So they are allowed in the outside, but if they have like a tremendous amount of chickens out there, once again, they're going to be pooping on that ground, not moving anywhere, not being rotated onto fresh pasture all the time. And on top of that, chickens kind of like wake up and they eat all day and then they go to sleep. They're like the perfect worker. They don't complain. They get up at the same time. They go to work. They work all day. Then they go to sleep. They don't go out. They don't party. They go to sleep at 5. Then they repeat that again. So they're the perfect worker. But if you have like 300, 400 of these chickens on a single acre, they'll basically consume like all the worms and all the natural food in that acre probably in like a day or two. So then the farmer is once again has to resort to feeding them a lot of inputs. So he has to bring in a lot of grains, a lot of corn and soy probably. Unless they have like a higher budget, there are a lot of different diets they can feed them. But like probably 90% of farmers still supplement heavily with corn and soy because it's inexpensive. And so you would have to ask them, oh, is this corn and soy organic? Because sometimes it's not. If it's not organic, then it's GMO corn and soy. And then obviously you have the residue, the biocide residue that's grown, that's used to grow that crop, making its way into the crop.
Yeah. Is there any way to, like, let's say you don't have a local farmer near because you live in a big, huge city. Is there any way to go, let's say, to a Whole Foods or our local grocer and actually find food that would be appropriate, or do we really need to find our local farmer?
I would say after all my research and kind of interviewing also one of your guests, which was Joel Salatin on your show, I saw you guys did multiple episodes with him, which is great. And that's how I actually found your YouTube channel. Basically, I would stay away from buying chicken and pork at the grocery store, period.
Okay.
Yeah, that's just the safe bet to say. Safe bet to kind of like a general rule to put out there. You can still buy like USDA organic fruits and vegetables, grains at the supermarket as well. A lot of wild caught fish is great at the supermarket as well. In terms of sustainability of how they're caught might be questionable, but that's up to the consumer to decide whether they want to support that. But in terms of the nutritional value, it's still there. The only problem with vegetables and fruit at the supermarket is the U.S. is, from my understanding, the only country that allows hydroponics fruit and vegetables to be sold as organic.
Okay.
Like no other country in the world like allows that for some reason, but it's totally okay in the U.S. So it's not even grown in soil,
right?
Which is kind of like, it's basically like an IV drip.
Yeah.
In a fake solution, and it's kind of grown in this container, like matrix-looking laboratory areas. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's questionable. So
because they're not getting the nutrients that are in the soil inherently. If you have good soil, which you got to start with really good soil, you're not going to get your selenium and your different micronutrients that you would normally get from the soil, right? So you really do want the soil, not just the hydroponic. In my opinion, too, I agree. I just don't think you're going to get what you need.
Exactly, and honestly, like I can't provide any like hardcore research that shows there's like a tremendous amount less micronutrients in the hydroponics versus like the soil grown organically produced produce. But one thing I do know is like the world has been around for like 4.5 billion years, and the universe has been around way longer than that. And it took that long of very, very complicated evolution to come up with the soil that exists today to be able to allow the production of the type of crop, So a lot of times I think science is great, but it gets a little ahead of itself from time to time. And like Paul Chek would always say, like every drug that was once scientifically proven to be safe, or every drug that has killed people was at one point scientifically proven to be completely safe. So it's one of those things. In my opinion, like when it comes to your health, always presume guilty until proven innocent. And one of my friends, Jator Pierre, would say that, so I'm kind of using his line there.
One of the things people hold guilty until proven innocent is genetically modified food. In fact, there's been laws against labeling of that, saying that they didn't want people to be biased against the product because it wasn't proven not safe or whatever. But you mentioned genetically modified in passing earlier when you were talking about food for animals. Can you talk to us about why it's difficult to avoid GMOs in the food that we do encounter, and maybe how we can avoid that if we want to?
Yeah, so from my understanding, the reason for those labeling laws is because one executive from Monsanto actually ran for office in the FDA and became director of the FDA. And ironically, during that time is when they passed those laws to say, oh, you don't have to label GMOs. So that's basically the background of how that lack of labeling exists in the U.S. There are labeling laws in other countries. Obviously, there are many countries, including like Russia and China, that don't even allow the sale of GMOs in their country. They allow the production of those, but if they're exported to the U.S., not actually sold in their country. So a lot of people kind of bagged on China of like, they're not environmentally friendly, and that in some cases they might be, but in this case, I would say they're ahead of the U.S. in terms of like regulations for GMOs. It's also very difficult because basically the U.S. gets like half of its grain from overseas, and at the organic level, there isn't any corruption overseas, and they get a lot of their grain from Turkey and Ukraine, for instance, which are super corrupt countries. I'm from Ukraine, nothing personal, but it's just how it is over there. So what happens is the corruption is at the broker level. So they'll ship the grain over here. Some guy will just change the paperwork around, and all of a sudden it's not factory farmed, it's organic. And it gets imported as organic into the US. And this happens like a tremendous amount. And there's also like a decent amount of corruption in the US. Like just, I think like 2 months ago, they caught a farmer, I forgot in the Midwest, I forgot exactly which state, but I'm pretty sure if the listener Googled it, they'll be able to find it. And he was basically, I think he produced like 9% of all the soy distributed in the US in the organic, but then they found out he wasn't even actually growing organically. He was just changing the paperwork around, and he did this for many, many years. So that happens as well. So I guess to be safe, if the farmer does supplement with corn and soy, the best thing you can do is ask, is it organic and is it produced locally? I'm not saying corruption, like as an example, doesn't exist at the local level, but I would say it's way, way, way less than if it's imported. And then obviously you would have to like trust the farmer. Is it really local? Is it imported? There's a lot of like ifs or buts about it. So
yeah, the other question we had is why factory farm meats. If you can explain to us why it might cause inflammation in our bodies.
Yeah, mainly because all the animals are fed nothing but corn and soy.
Oh, okay.
And they're not fed a species-specific diet. Like, for instance, with cows, they're supposed to be eating grass or hay or something like that. They're, once again, just heavily fed corn and soy. And so there's a lot of grass-fed misconception as well. So all cattle are grass-fed. That's important to consider. Like basically within a 2-year raising cycle, they spend like about 90% of their life on pasture eating grass, all cows, no matter who they are. That's just how they're raised. You can't actually feed grains to cows from day one or they'll die. But basically at that last 10% of their life or so, like 90% of them are sent to feedlots where they're fed nothing but corn and soy predominantly. And once again, just this short amount of time is enough to ruin the micronutrient profile of the meat, shooting the omega-6 way up, lowering it actually doesn't affect the omega-3, but what happens is it just shoots the omega-6 way up, so it ruins the natural ratio of omega-3 to omega-6. And because of that lack of balance, it should be like 1-to-1, but it's usually a lot of cases like 1-to-20. So you're going to get like a tremendous amount of mainly inflammation from factory farm meats because they rely on corn and soy because it's subsidized, it's cheap, it's subsidized by the taxpayer. And 80% of a farmer's cost is just feeding the animals. So if you can get 80% of that cost decreased dramatically, that's a huge incentive to basically get the taxpayer to pay that for you. And the funny thing is with small farms in the US is how it works is there's a vertically integrated system. So in short, I don't want to kind of bore you guys too much with this stuff, but basically in short, there's like a huge company. Let's say you guys are a small farmer. I'm Tyson Foods, which is a huge poultry producer, #1 poultry producer. And in fact, they started the factory farm model. It was started in like about 1960 by 2 American guys, John and Don Tyson. And basically I come to you and I'm like, okay, so I will bring you, I have the hatcheries, I have the vaccines, I have the patented grains, I have the slaughter facilities, which are worth like millions and millions and millions of dollars. I have the veterinarians. I'll take care of everything. I just need you to grow these 30,000 chickens I bring to you once every 4 weeks to exactly my standards. If I tell you they need to be grown with these drugs, you need to give them the drugs. If I tell you they need to be inside, they need to be inside. And for the farmer, it's tempting because it takes a lot of the responsibility off their hands. Now they could literally just be farmers. They don't have to be the marketing guy. They don't have to be the logistics guy. They don't have to be the accountant guy. So they'll be like, okay, sure. But once they do that, once they do that, Tyson Foods will go like, okay, but your shed is too small. We need you to take out a bank loan for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 and build a bigger facility so it can house these 30,000 plus chickens. But no problem, because we already have a bank that we work with, and they're basically going to approve you if we send you their way. And the reason they're going to approve you is because I forget the name of the law, but basically there's like a farmer relief fund. And if the small farmer goes out of business, the taxpayer will bail out the loan that they can't pay back to the bank.
Wow.
So it's no loss. It's no loss whatsoever to that business, and no loss to the bank, because they collect the interest while the farmer is in business. And then once they go out of business, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to get the taxpayer to pay me back. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to me. And how it works is basically at that point, they have complete control over this farmer. Now this farmer is making $50,000 to $60,000 a year, maybe, and they're like $300,000 in debt. And that's like before they pay taxes, they're making that amount of money. So that basically they can't say no at that point, because they'll lose their house, they'll lose their farm, they'll lose their land, and then whatever else the bank can't get the money from, they'll just get it from the taxpayer. So it's like they export a lot of their cost to the taxpayer. That's why the meat's kind of like, it seems a lot lower at the supermarket, but it's really not, because you're paying for it indirectly through your taxes. So you could add easily another $2 to $3 per pound on that. You're just not seeing that right away. But yeah, the cost is happening to you no matter what.
Before we let go of the topic of genetically modified labeling, that was the only thing we touched on, I think, on how you can know about that is whether there's any labeling on the product that you purchase, or whether you talk to the producer and they can tell you. Is there any other approach that you're aware of to help people avoid GMOs if that's what they want to do?
Yeah, at the supermarket level, together, if they see the USDA organic plus the non-GMO Project Verified stamp on the same product, that's the gold standard for like GMO free. Another thing they can do is just avoid all corn, soy, and canola products. That basically will eliminate your chances of being exposed to GMOs, probably 95% right there. There's cotton. GMO cotton is very common too. You typically don't find that in a lot of foods. And you want to also avoid meats that are obviously fed that genetically modified corn and soy. So it kind of gets a little tricky,
Yeah, it does.
There's a lot of gray area there.
Right.
Because a lot of people are like, oh, I eat this USDA organic vegetables, and I know it's not GMOs, but then I'm buying this factory farm food, which is fed GMO corn and soy, which is making it into the meat, the organs, the fat of the animal tissue, and then you're eating that. That's going to make it into your body as well. And there's a lot of chemicals, like very dangerous chemicals, glyphosate being the most popular one these days, that's used to grow these crops. And in huge quantities, because these crops are genetically modified to resist this chemical. So typically the farmers just spray endlessly. So you actually get more exposure of it, because it's not going to kill the plant. It's just going to kill the weeds around the plant.
Wow. Okay.
That's like
so that's
Roundup Ready and ads we've seen like that. It says like, if they treat with that, if they buy those seeds, then they can spray all this herbicide all they want. It's not going to kill their crop plant.
Right. And I guess speaking
not kill their crop plant, but maybe kill you.
Yeah, right. And
sometime down the line.
Speaking of that, the use of pesticides and how that's accelerating, disease, destroying our health and accelerating disease, I guess would be the question. How it, if I was just personal, we see it in our water here, where there's so much use by farmers in our area of chemicals and stuff, and it gets into the groundwater, and then we deal with algae blooms in the water, and then they have to try to take that out, and then there's a microcystin, which was very, very bad mycotoxin, very bad for us. So we can already just see just from that aspect that it can very much affect your health. So, but what else might cause us health problems down the road?
Yeah, so there's a great book called The Myths of Safe Pesticides by Andre Liu. I think he's a great author. I had a chance to interview him, gathering all this research as well for this book also. And basically, I give grocery store tours in my local area to people that are interested in knowing food production practices and kind of making better choices. And when I found there are basically three very, very common myths that, because a lot of people, they know there are chemicals on their food for the most part. But they're like, they don't, there are three myths that justify their continued purchase of that product. So one of them, the most common one, is basically the chemicals are tested for safety. And the government wouldn't allow something that's not safe into the food production system. So this is like a 5-hour conversation in and of itself. But just basically to break it down in short, there is no complete product that's basically, no complete pesticide product that's basically tested for safety in the US. So basically there are two main ingredients in a compound, in a chemical compound. There's the active and then there's the inert or inactive ingredient. And basically legally, all the chemical company has to do is test the active ingredient in isolation on its own without the presence of the inactive ingredient. They never test the complete formulation altogether. So this is a problem because the inactive ingredients are meant to actually make the active ingredient stronger and more persistent in the environment. So obviously when you take away those inactive, those supporting ingredients, it's not going to be as strong, so it's going to pass safety testings. And also their safety testing is like super wishy-washy too. A lot of times people think like government agencies are the ones that do the safety testing. Actually, they do the safety testing in-house by their scientists in the chemical companies, and then they send those reports to the FDA to evaluate the reports. So that's how it works, you know? So that's already like a red flag. And on top of that, in the real world, in a single crop production cycle of tomatoes, for instance, like a farmer would use maybe like 7 to 15 different chemicals. But in these laboratories, they're using just one chemical of one active ingredient of a chemical, not even the entire formulation in isolation on its own. So that's another, there's like a cocktail effect, and there's a synergy effect of all these chemicals working together. Obviously, taking 10 pharmaceutical drugs at once, who knows what kind of reaction, and you hear people die of that all the time, you know, I'm taking this. There are no studies done on how these drugs are going to interact with one another. And like I mentioned before, like a lot of times results speak for themselves. A lot of people are like, oh, this guy's exaggerating. Although they can go to PubMed.gov and easily see like hundreds of peer-reviewed studies, especially from Cyrilini Labs, which has just recently been releasing. This is like 5 years ago, and he's the first person to test like a complete formulation for its lethality.
Wow.
You know, it's like no one has even gotten around to doing that. And when you ask to see a lot of the studies from these chemical companies, they just don't release them. Like if you're doing legit studies, they only release them if there's like a lawsuit, if there's a disgruntled employee that leaks the studies, something of that sort. And it's usually like the studies are like super wishy-washy. They'll never make it through the peer review process. Because it's kind of like Andre Luce stated in his book a lot of times, if you're so proud of your research or how safe your product is, like if you graduated from Stanford, why wouldn't you say it on your resume you graduated from Stanford? Why do you just hide it, you know? So obviously you're hiding something because you know it's not adding up. You know what I mean? Like another myth is like, oh, I'm just going to wash off these pesticides from my fruit. But most modern pesticides are systemic pesticides, so they get soaked up by the plant and become embedded as part of the nutritional profile of the actual like flesh. I know it's not flesh, like whatever crop doesn't have flesh, but I don't know the word for it. The actual nutritional profile of the vegetables and fruits. So you can't wash that off, and you're going to get exposed to that.
So even if it has a hard outside, let's say a watermelon, you think, well, if I just cut off the rind and scrub it and all of that, I'll be fine because it's not going to get into the flesh or the meat of the watermelon. You're saying no, it does. It will get absorbed through the plant.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
It's part of the whole entire food group in that case. And when you count like, oh, I'm eating this, I'm eating that, you probably eat like 10 different food groups a day. It kind of adds up like quite a bit. And I know there's, I forget, I'm not good at memorizing studies, but I'm pretty sure people can find these on PubMed.gov. But there's one study which basically said that like the average newborn in America has trace amounts of like 200 different chemicals in their bloodstream. And that's how like they're starting life, with like 200 chemicals floating around, trace amounts of chemicals floating around in their bloodstream. Yeah, and then another one is like sometimes people say, oh, I can't even see the residue. It's like so small, it's not going to affect me. And once again, you can go to PubMed.gov and you'll see that, especially like with the more popular ones, and there's so many studies coming out on glyphosate, even like 1 part per trillion, which is 1 drop in three size Olympic-sized swimming pools, has an effect on your hormonal balance.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
So that's the 3 I hear most often. of why they justify the purchase
It can
of
be
that.
so bewildering. And we've been talking now about vegetables. Before you were talking about meats. What about fish? You can go, like, you buy a salmon or something, and it'll either say, wild caught, or it'll say farm raised or whatever. Farm raised sounds like, oh, that sounds good because it's not going to be depleting the natural population, the fishing population. So what's wrong with farm raised fish, or what are the hazards that we need to be aware of about that?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different farm-raised fish operations. They have some that are on land. They have some that are on the coast. I think now they have even some that are deep out at sea. But basically, it's still kind of like the same system. They're just heavily reliant on, like, corn and soy, like GMO corn and soy. Also, they're heavily reliant on basically like a processed form of other small little fish. And the problem with that is they use kind of like a preservative called intoxicine, which is, once again, a chemical made by Monsanto to actually preserve this food. And that's fed to the fish. Once again, all those pesticides that are used to grow that genetically modified corn and soy that we just talked about also is compounded into that fish. The omega-6, once again, shoots way up because they're not eating their natural diet. They're not going anywhere. There's still like 1 million fish in this Encompass like net. And usually below those, in terms of not impacting the environment, there's a huge impact to the environment. I remember there's a really good documentary called Norwegian Salmon, Most Toxic Fish in the World or something. People can find that on YouTube. It's really good. And it shows you the devastation it's caused to the local salmon population of Norway by having these fish farms in the different canals. And they showed like a topical, like a bird's eye view of a map, and it just shows like in one stream, just like there's no more fish, period, that happen to go through this where they're actually breeding these fish. So yeah, same exact problems. High amounts of concentration. Obviously these fish will get sick because they're very, very stressed. Industrial amount of antibiotics need to be fed to the fish. You're going to get exposure to that. Pesticides are sprayed directly on the fish in that case as well. So you're going to get exposure to that. I feel very few people will argue about the fact that farm-raised fish is kind of some of the most toxic food you could eat, especially like tilapia or farm-raised salmon, for example.
Yeah, the other question we had, and I think it ties in real well, because obviously a lot of these farm-raised fish are, ruining the oceans, then especially if they're, being farmed near the ocean. The other is our quality of water, which we've had to wrestle with here, but and I think nobody is addressing this either. Not only, the pesticides that's getting in our water, but the hormones from women taking the pill or something, so that men are now getting estrogen, and it's like they don't want to touch that subject because people want access to their birth control. But it's like, we need to be talking about this because it's dangerous for men to be ingesting estrogen, and it's dangerous for women to be ingesting too much estrogen. So how do we get quality water would be my other question.
Yeah, so that varies from region to region. Basically, on this subject, you want to look for 3 variables in water: the pH, the hardness, and the total dissolved solids. Those will determine if the water is good for in terms of will provide a good nutritional value for you, not if the water has high toxicity. That's another subject we'll cover in a second. But basically, you want hard water. You don't want to be drinking soft water like distilled water or water from like a reverse osmosis machine. Just straight from a reverse osmosis machine. There are different places, kind of like water breweries, that kind of filter it through different like seaweed and stuff like that. I'm not too familiar with that process, to tell you the truth. Then it might bring up the pH level, because you'll notice with water that comes from reverse osmosis or that comes from distilled water, the pH is like 2 out of the ideal of 7 or 8. So it's very, very acidic water. So the more the water is filtered, obviously, the more chemicals you're going to get rid of, but also the more of those healthy nutrients you're going to get rid of as well. And the water is the most important nutrient on Earth. Like all life ceases to exist the second water disappears, basically. So it's tricky because the ecosystem is so polluted these days, and everything is recycled in the ecosystem. The coal plant puts the mercury into the clouds. The mercury rain from the clouds goes into the ocean, then it's converted into like methyl mercury in the ocean. then it goes back into the soil, or it rains back into the soil, then it goes back into the sea, and it's kind of like this endless kind of loop of pollution where one person pollutes in one side of the world, you're going to get it in the other. Everyone's a player in that case. So in that case, it's a tricky subject. Like, I drink artesian water, but I'm pretty sure there are trace amounts of chemicals even in that water. I wouldn't deny it. So one thing people can do if they're worried, any water utility company is required to send you a free toxicology report. Just go to their website or contact them, ask them to send you the report. They'll send you a list of trace amounts of different chemicals found in your water. Now, the only kind of shortfall of this is they only test for about maybe 80 to 120 different chemicals, but there are like thousands of chemicals in the environment. And usually, like the place where I'm at, there is in Irvine, California. They have like a really good water utility company, and I ordered that report, and you still see like trace amounts of like 30 different chemicals. So in some areas, they're not going to have as great of a filtration system. But having said that, it did say 30 different chemicals. But once again, they didn't test for all the chemicals. So I'm pretty sure if they tested for every chemical on the market, they're going to find probably like 400 trace amounts of 400 different chemicals in every single cup of water, like you're drinking, you're cooking with, is just affecting, you're taking a shower with as well. It's just affecting your whole entire quality of life, basically.
Okay. So for someone like us or other people who do have a filtration system, we have the reverse osmosis, and thought that was a good thing. Is there anything we could add to our water so that we're getting something back that's good?
To replace the minerals?
To replace the minerals.
Yeah, one thing you can do is basically I like using Celtic sea salt.
Okay.
That'll shoot the pH, the total dissolved solids, and the hardness way up to the ideal level. So the ideal pH, don't know these numbers exactly. I'm kind of I forget them exactly, but they're in my book. Basically, the ideal pH is between like 7 to 8. The ideal total hardness is like 300 parts per million. The ideal total dissolved solids, is 300 parts per million. And the ideal hardness is like 120 parts per million. I have to check those numbers, but it's like roughly around that. So you can get these test kits on Amazon for very, very cheap. That pH tester, the total dissolved solids tester, and the hardness tester, you can get all three of those for probably like $30. And then just put that Celtic sea salt in there and test it all, and then get the ratio right. And then you're like, okay, so I need 1 teaspoon per 2 liters. And ideally, I would just like put it in there and then have it sit in the fridge overnight. That way, when you drink it in the morning, it's kind of like very saturated into the water. That's one thing you could do. Some people would argue, like some holistic experts would then say, like, oh, it's still not replicating the amount of nutrients lost in the water. And it's probably not. But then on the other hand, you're also, with reverse osmosis, the plus thing is you're not getting exposure to all those chemicals. Reverse osmosis will eliminate like the bulk majority of any chemicals you'll find in your water. So it's kind of a give or take, I don't think any system is right or wrong. It's just like which pluses and which minuses do you want to deal with at any given day.
Right. And I think people will be very interested in where they can find your book, the Anti-Factory Farm book. Where might they find it?
Yeah, so right now I just have it on Amazon. It's Anti-Factory Farm Shopping Guide. And then also on my website, trufkinathletics.com. On my website, I just have the PDF version. On Amazon, they can get the hard copy plus the Kindle.
Yeah, that's always nice, yeah.
We've been speaking with Eugene Trufkin from TrufkinAthletics.com and the author of the Anti-Factory Farm Shopping Guide. Eugene, before we let you go, can you stick around another minute so we can ask you a bonus question for our Patreon subscribers?
Yeah, sure.
Great. So
thanks.
If those of you who aren't already, you can become a Patreon subscriber by going to patreon.com/healingyourself. Go ahead and sign up at any level, and you'll get access to this and other exclusive bonus footage going forward. And I just wanted to thank you, Eugene, for joining us this first time on HealingYourself.Life.
That's great.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Hey, HealingYourself.Life viewers.
We need your help in enabling us to continue to create great health videos for you.
So please support our mission by going to patreon.com/healingyourself and pledging any monthly amount you can.
Your pledge will also help us to afford a new Lyme peptide treatment therapy to improve our memory, and we will report on our progress to benefit you and others.
So remember, go to patreon.com/healingyourself and pledge today.
Were you going to tell them to go to patreon.com/healingyourself to pledge to help our memory treatment?
I thought I did. I'll do it. So please go to patreon.com/healingyourself and pledge today.
Thanks.